In this program, we will outline a step-by-step procedure for replacing the Vega cylinder head gasket. The design of the Vega overhead cam engine makes the job of replacing the head gasket different than replacing the head gasket on a more conventional engine, but not necessarily more difficult. The procedure illustrated in this program is presented in the sequence suggested in the Vega Service and Overhaul Manual and the Chevrolet Service News of August 1972. The special tools and equipment you will need to replace the Vega cylinder head gasket include a steel straight edge, feeler gauges, anti-seize compound, torque wrenches, Vega timing belt tension adapter, and belt tension gauge. Before starting to remove the cylinder head, disconnect the Energizer negative cable. This will eliminate the possibility of shorting the electrical system while performing the service operation. Then, with the car raised, disconnect the exhaust pipe from the manifold. Neither the exhaust nor the intake manifold have to be removed when replacing the Vega head gasket. If you're working on a Vega that is not equipped with air conditioning, remove the engine fan and spacer while the car is still on the lift. Support both the fan and spacer as you remove the last of the 4 mounting bolts. Then, after lowering the car, drain the cooling system at the radiator drain, lower radiator hose, or siphon the coolant from the radiator. If you use the siphoning method, do not start the siphoning action with your mouth, since the coolant solution is poisonous. If you're working on a Vega that is equipped with air conditioning, you must remove the fan shroud to gain access to the engine fan and spacer. So, after disconnecting the exhaust pipe from the manifold, remove the screw holding the 2 shroud halves together at the lower left corner. Then, lower the car, remove the 2 radiator and shroud retaining screws, and pull the shroud up out of the 2 bottom retaining clips. Next, remove the air cleaner assembly. If the carburetor is a Rochester single barrel, remove the air cleaner assembly only. If the carburetor is a Holley 2-barrel, such as the one shown here, disconnect the air cleaner assembly and the air duct to the silencer. The silencer itself need not be removed. Then, disconnect the upper heater hose and bracket from the cylinder head. On engines equipped with the Holley 5210 2-barrel carburetor, disconnect the upper heater hose at the carburetor choke housing. It is not necessary to remove the hose between the intake manifold and the 5210 carburetor, since it is not necessary to remove the carburetor when changing the head gasket. Access for removing the timing belt is gained by removing the engine front cover. Start by loosening the 2 lower engine front cover screws. It is not necessary to remove either of these lower screws, since the cover is slotted at these 2 mounting points. Therefore, when the upper retaining screw and nut are removed, the engine front cover can be removed easily. Align the timing marks before removing the timing belt. To remove the timing belt from the cam sprocket, loosen the 4 bolts retaining the water pump just enough to slacken the belt. Then pull the belt free of the cam sprocket. On the right side of the engine, remove the distributor cap, disconnect the primary ignition coil wire inside the distributor and the secondary coil wire at the distributor. Then remove the vacuum line to the vacuum advance solenoid and the spark plug wires. Also, disconnect the wire at the temperature switch. On the left side of the engine, disconnect the fuel line, vacuum lines, throttle linkage, and automatic transmission linkage if so equipped. The next operation is to remove the Delcotron. On models without power steering, it is mounted on the left side of the engine, but on models with power steering, it is mounted on the right side of the engine. The mounting hardware is completely different for the 2 installations. In either case, detach the accessory drive belt first. To do this, on models with power steering, loosen both front and rear Delcotron brace bolts. On models without power steering, loosen the single front brace bolt. The Delcotron and its attaching hardware can now be disengaged from the cylinder head. On models without power steering, support the Delcotron, remove the single mounting bolt, the brace bolt, and the rear brace. Then lay the Delcotron and brace assembly to the side. To disengage the Delcotron from models with power steering, support the unit, remove the single mount bolt and both brace bolts, and move the Delcotron to one side. Then remove the mounting bracket and rear brace from the head. The power steering pump itself need not be removed. It is only necessary to disconnect the rear mounting bracket. This bracket is attached to the intake manifold by a single mounting bolt. Remove the camshaft cover next by disconnecting the PCV valve from the grommet at the front end of the cover and removing the 10 cover-to-cylinder head retaining screws. Then pull the cover. Retain the gasket unless it is damaged. An AIR pump was installed on some 1972 Vegas. This pump, its mounting bracket, and the tube and diverter valve connecting the pump to the cylinder head must be removed. The procedure for removing this assembly is contained in the 1972 Vega Service and Overhaul Manual. Remove the 10 cylinder head bolts. The bolts used on the manifold side of the head are about an inch longer than those used on the spark plug side. Do not mix the two different length bolts. The oil dipstick tube mounting bracket is the last item you must disengage before removing the head. It is attached to the exhaust manifold by a single bolt. With the help of an assistant, remove the manifold and cylinder head assembly and move it to a bench. Place the cylinder head on its side with the manifold assembly facing up. Rest the cylinder head on 2 blocks of wood to prevent damage to the distributor and temperature switch. Thoroughly clean the deck surface of the block and mating surface of the head. Be extremely careful not to brush dirt or chunks of the old gasket into any of the cylinders or coolant passages. If you have trouble removing the old gasket from the head, carefully heat the gasket material with a propane torch. Do not use a torch on the block. Using an accurate steel straightedge, carefully check the cleaned surface of the head for flatness. Measured lengthwise, there should not be more than 6/1000 of an inch clearance between your straightedge and the head surface. Measured crosswise, the clearance should not be more than 3/1000 of an inch. If the head is not flat within these specifications, replace the head. Next, carefully check for block deck shrinkage to determine if the tops of the cylinder bores have dropped below the level of the outer block surface. Take this measurement with the straightedge crosswise on the deck at each of the 3 places where 2 cylinder walls are joined. Clearance between the deck surface and the straightedge should be less than 3/1000 of an inch. Refer to your recent service news or service bulletin for information concerning the procedure to follow in repairing damaged blocks. When ordering a new gasket, keep in mind that there have been 3 different head gasket designs for the Vega. The one shown here, which is the latest design, is the only gasket currently recommended for surface usage. You are now ready to reassemble the engine. Install the new gasket over the dowel pins in the block with the smooth side of the gasket facing up. With the help of an assistant, carefully lower the head and manifold assembly into place over the dowel pins and gasket. Be extremely careful not to damage the oil dipstick tube or the transmission linkage if you're working on a car with an automatic transmission. Inserting 2 cylinder head bolts before lowering the head will help guide the head into place, thus minimizing the possibility of damaging the new gasket. Before installing the cylinder head bolts, clean them thoroughly. Then apply anti-seize compound. Be very careful not to mix the 2 different length bolts. You will see the reason for this shortly. Tighten the cylinder head bolts a little at a time in the sequence shown here until all bolts are firmly seated. Be extremely careful when tightening the 4 end bolts, since their holes are blind. That is, the holes are not open at the bottom. Therefore, if for some reason the holes for the 4 end bolts are obstructed, or if you attempt to insert the longer bolts that belong in the manifold side into one of the end holes in the spark plug side, you could crack the block. With a torque wrench, continue to tighten the bolts in the previously illustrated sequence until they are torqued to the proper value. Remember, these bolts are steel, whereas the block is aluminum. If you exceed the proper torque value on these bolts, you could strip the threads in the block. After the cylinder head bolts have been properly torqued, reinstall the camshaft cover. If the camshaft cover gasket was not damaged when the cover was removed, the same gasket can be reused. Before setting the cover in place, inspect the oil filler cap and grommets, replacing any excessively worn or broken parts if necessary. Don't forget to reconnect the oil dipstick tube mounting bracket. With the camshaft cover installed and its retaining screws torqued to the proper value, reconnect the PCV valve and hose to the grommet at the front of the cover. Reinstalling the Delcotron is next. On Vega engines equipped with power steering, reinstall the rear brace and mounting bracket on the cylinder head. Then, support the Delcotron in place. Install the mounting bolt and finger tighten the brace bolts. Then install the retaining bolt for the rear bracket of the power steering pump. On Vegas not equipped with power steering, hold the Delcotron and bracket in place and reinstall the 3 bracket support bolts, the 1 mounting bolt, and rear brace. Then finger tighten the brace bolt. Next, reconnect the fuel line, vacuum lines, and accelerator linkage. If the car has an automatic transmission, reconnect the transmission linkage. Install the distributor cap, reconnect the spark plug wires, both ignition coil wires, and the vacuum line to the vacuum advance solenoid at the distributor. Also, don't forget to reconnect the electrical connector at the engine temperature switch. After checking the timing marks to be certain that they have not been misaligned, replace the timing belt over the cam sprocket. To re-establish the correct timing belt tension, insert the special Vega belt tension adapter into the gauge hole adjacent to the left side of the water pump. Then, using a torque wrench, apply 15 pounds of pressure to the water pump. While maintaining this pressure, tighten all 4 water pump bolts. Next, reinstall the engine front cover. To do this, hold the cover in position and finger tighten the 2 lower cover screws. Then, install the upper screw and nut and torque all of the cover fasteners to the proper torque. Install the accessory drive belt, and after tightening the generator brace bolts, use a belt tension gauge to be sure that the proper drive belt tension has been obtained. Reinstall the fan spacer and fan. Torque the 4 attaching bolts to specifications. Then, if the car is not equipped with air conditioning, install the upper radiator hose. However, if the car is equipped with air conditioning, install the fan shroud, the shroud retaining screws, and the upper radiator hose. Reconnect the upper heater hose bracket to the cylinder head and then connect the hose at the engine or at the carburetor choke housing if the carburetor is a Holley 2-barrel. If the carburetor is a Rochester single barrel, reinstall the air cleaner assembly. If the carburetor is a Holley 2-barrel, reinstall the air cleaner assembly and reconnect the air duct to the silencer. Then, with the car raised, reconnect the exhaust pipe to the manifold. Your final steps are to reconnect the Energizer ground cable, refill the cooling system with the correct coolant solution, and then check for leaks and smooth engine operation. When filling the cooling system, first be sure to fill the radiator completely. Then fill the coolant recovery bottle. Any Vega that is not equipped with a coolant recovery system should be modified to provide the recovery capability. Installation of the coolant recovery kit on a no-charge to the customer basis has been authorized by Chevrolet for any Vega that is not so equipped. This policy holds true even if the Vega in question is no longer under warranty. If the engine does not start, it may be that the cylinder head was tilted far enough so that all of the fuel in the carburetor bowl was lost. In such cases, priming the engine should solve the problem. This concludes the procedure for replacing a Vega cylinder head gasket. The important points to remember include: follow a set sequence so that you will not accidentally forget to disconnect or reconnect any components. Be sure to install the correct length head bolts during reassembly. Torque all attaching bolts to specifications. Be sure to install only the latest design head gasket. And install a coolant recovery system if one is not already installed.